Hi, this is Josh Kulp. We are learning Daf Nun Gimel, page 53 of Masechet Avodah Zarah. The Daf begins with a Mishnah that talks about how one annuls an idol. And again, I want to sort of make sure that we appreciate what a radical notion this is for Chazal. In the Torah, we read of destroying idols. And pitom, all of a sudden, in rabbinic literature, we read about annulling them, which basically means taking the idolatrous nature out of them and making them usable by Jews. And it's really a sea change in the Jews' attitude, certainly in the rabbinic attitude towards idolatry. One thing that scholars have noticed is that this Mishnah in particular is definitely influenced by Roman law. In Roman law, if you wanted to annul the statue or perhaps a coin of a previously ruling emperor, one thing you could do is rub out its face. And here it is in the Mishnah, we read that how do you annul an idol? Basically, you deface it. And I have a whole article on that. I could send you a link if you're interested. And I think it's kind of an interesting twist that in a Mishnah about annulling idolatry, which is essentially Greco-Roman culture, the rabbis have actually adopted a norm from the culture that, in a sense, they're trying to, if you will, annul. And that's probably typical of what I might call colonized people whose culture has been taken over by another culture. They, without even noticing it, will take on the norms and the values of that other culture because it's impossible not to when you're living among such a dominant culture. In any case, there's also a discussion in the Mishnah about cursing or disrespecting an idol. And like with a friend or perhaps a family member, you can curse or disrespect a family member or a friend. You shouldn't, but it happens all the time. People get angry, and that doesn't mean that the friendship is over. And I would say the same thing the rabbis are ascribing to a god here. You can get angry at your god, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship, the divinity of that god has been removed. There is then following a long discussion about selling an idol to, or selling coins or pieces of an idol to a smelter. The question is there, what can we assume that the smelter will do with this idol? Will he boil it down, melt it down, and use the metal, which is clearly a case of annulment? Or might he worship it? And there's various factors. Is it an idolatrous smelter, or is it an Israelite smelter? And I wanted to point out that in all of these types of discussions, we're not talking about a case where we know what the person did. We're talking about what can we assume that he might do. Oftentimes students will ask me, well, let's just ask the person. And that's really not what rabbinic literature is about. Rabbinic literature is about sort of making a priori assumptions about what somebody might do in a case where we could check, but we want to figure out like sort of categorically what the law is, and not simply in a case where we really know what the person's intent was. The last part of a page turns to a very interesting discussion about Joshua's conquering of the land, because it had been mentioned in a Mishnah about abandoning idols. And if people abandon them such as they did in the time of Joshua without hope of return, then that's considered annulment. But more interesting than that is I think, a very fascinating discussion about the trees that the Israelites would have found planted in the land of Israel when they came to conquer it with Joshua. There's a principle that we've seen many times before, that a person cannot cause something that belongs to somebody else to become prohibited. So if I bow down to your dog doesn't become prohibited. Or if I bow down to your teapot doesn't become prohibited, even if I would consider it a god, because it's not mine. I can only prohibit things that belong to me. Otherwise, somebody could go and just cause other people's stuff to become prohibited. But when you think about those trees, if we have the ideology that from the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Israelites possessed the land, or God had given them the land of Canaan as a possession, then in reality, the Canaanites, by bowing down, by worshiping these already existing trees, are prohibiting something that doesn't belong to them. So from here, they come up with a notion that Israel had become, in a sense, idolatrous from the time of worshiping of the golden calf. And as such, they had sort of given permission. They had revealed their their tacit permission to non-Jews, to idolaters, to worship things inside the land of Israel, just as if I was an idolater and I had something and you bowed down to it. You might say, look, I gave you in a sense permission because I'm an idolater too. And when Israel became inherently idolaters at the time of the golden calf, so therefore when the non-Jews, when the Canaanites worshipped those trees, they were doing it b'shlichut, with the agency of Israel. It's a very deep notion, and it's an interesting question to start to think. When did that change? When did Israel stop becoming idolaters? It's not talked about in our daf here, but at some point we have to assume that Israel stopped becoming inherently idolaters. Otherwise, the entire Masechet doesn't really make all that much sense. The Mishnah finishes, the daf finishes with another Mishnah that talks a little bit about abandoning idols, and also talks about pedestals on which king statues were put. I just want to point out another interesting phenomenon that you should always pay attention for, and that is when the Agadah, the stories of how the Amoraim actually act, are different from the abstract halacha. And here you have a case of Ula, he just goes and sits on a pedestal. It's a broken pedestal, but we find over and over throughout the Masechet that the way that the Amoraim actually act is relatively lenient vis-a-vis the abstract halacha. So that's a phenomenon to pay attention for, particularly in our Masechet, but also in other Masechtot as well. Good luck.